The wasp nest exploded in my face, stinging, burning, swarming. I swung blindly through the attic dust, my childhood home now a labyrinth of my mother's lies. The diary was supposed to be mine, untouched, but someone had been here. Red ink bled through the pages, rewriting my memories. My own mother's hand had done this. And the worst part? She wasn't even losing her mind. She was sharpening hers against me. The lock on the chest clicked open, but the truth inside was worse than any wasp sting. A receipt, fresh and damning. She'd been here last week, not confused, not sick, calculating. The diary wasn't just altered, it was a weapon, and I'd just handed it to her. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light piercing the attic's circular window as Sarah Miller stepped onto the floorboards. Her weight triggered a groan from the ancient wood, a sound that seemed to echo through the very bones of the Connecticut house. The air tasted of cedar and decades of trapped heat, a suffocating blanket that pressed against her skin. Near the eaves, a low thrumming vibrated through the rafters, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that set her teeth on edge. A paper nest, gray and bulbous, like a rotting lung, clung to the chimney stack, its surface shimmering with the movement of 100 tiny bodies. Sarah's eyes scanned the graveyard of her mother's past, her gaze clinical and cold. She moved toward a heavy cedar chest, her breath shallow and controlled. A yellow jacket spiraled upward from the shadows, its legs trailing like thin wires. It circled her head before landing on the rusted latch of the chest. Sarah didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, pitted metal. The swarm erupted. A dozen insects spiraled into the stagnant air, their wings producing a frantic, high-pitched whine that drowned out the quiet of the house below. One landed on her wrist, its abdomen pulsing with a primitive, violent intent. Sarah clamped her teeth together, refusing to give the house the satisfaction of a scream. She shoved the lid open. The hinges shrieked, a metallic protest that vibrated through her palms. Inside, buried beneath moth-eaten wool blankets that smelled of camphor and neglect, lay the Bluebird diary. Its sapphire leather cover shimmered under the grime, a shock of vibrant color in the gray tomb of the attic. A wasp dived toward her temple, the hum vibrating against her skin like a live wire. She snatched the book, the embossed bird pressing into her palm with a sharp, physical reality. As she retreated toward the stairs, a sharp sting blossomed on her forearm, a white-hot needle prick that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. She ignored the fire spreading under her skin, clutching the record of her mother's secrets against her ribs as she descended into the stifling floral scent of the hallway below. The attic had been a battlefield, but the rest of the house felt like a meticulously curated museum of a life Sarah no longer recognized. As she reached the landing, the weight of the cedar chest's contents seemed to follow her. In her haste to escape the wasps, she had knocked a smaller box from the trunk, and its contents had spilled across the floorboards like a deck of cards. "Sarah, is that you making all that racket?" The voice floated up from the kitchen, soft and melodic, yet it carried a sharp edge that cut through the humid air. Eleanor Miller was standing at the base of the stairs, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her cashmere cardigan a shade of pale lavender that made her look fragile, almost translucent. She tilted her head, a predator's focus disguised as a mother's concern. "Just moving some things, Mother." Sarah replied, her voice flat, stripped of the audit speak she usually employed in the city. She knelt to gather the scattered archives. There were birth certificates, old utility bills, and several thick envelopes from a bank in Manhattan that had closed its doors 10 years ago. A heavy tread sounded on the front porch, followed by the rhythmic thud hiss of the screen door. Mark Davis stepped into the foyer, his broad shoulders blocking out the afternoon sun. He looked at Sarah, then at the red welt rising on her arm, and finally at the sapphire book gripped in her hand. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew better. Instead, he reached for a stack of yellowed ledgers that had fallen near the banister. "You shouldn't be up there alone," Mark said, his voice a low rumble. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes fixed on his boots. "The structure is soft. My dad always said these old houses breathe, and sometimes they choke." Together, they began to sort through the debris. Sarah's fingers, encased in thin nitrile gloves, moved with the precision of a surgeon. She aligned the edges of the papers, her mind already building a digital map of the chaos. Among the mess, she found a series of records she didn't recognize. Property deeds for a small plot in Maine and a series of wire transfer receipts that didn't match the family's known income. Mark watched her, his expression unreadable, though his hand subconsciously went to his pocket, where Sarah knew he kept his father's last grocery list. The air in the hallway grew thick with the smell of old paper and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender floor wax Eleanor insisted on using daily. Sarah retreated to the small desk in the guest room, the Bluebird diary sitting before her like an unexploded bomb. The sapphire leather was cool to the touch, but the small, integrated lock on the side was a barrier she hadn't anticipated. It was a delicate brass mechanism, the kind that required a tiny, heart-shaped key she hadn't seen in 20 years. She didn't have the key, but she had her archival toolkit. She pulled a thin, stainless steel probe from her bag, a tool usually reserved for prying apart pages stuck together by mold. Her breath hitched as she inserted the metal into the lock. The house was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic humming coming from the kitchen. Eleanor was singing "Abide with Me," the low, mournful tune vibrating through the floorboards. Click. The lock yielded with a sharp, metallic snap. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled the diary open, but as she did, a small slip of paper fluttered out and landed on the rug. She picked it up. It was a receipt from a local Staples, dated only 6 days ago. The item purchased, a 3-pack of fine-tip red ink pens. A cold shiver raced down Sarah's spine. This diary had been locked in a forgotten trunk in a wasp-infested attic, yet someone had been here. Someone had been buying supplies. The receipt was crisp, the ink fresh. It was a physical contradiction to the narrative Eleanor had been spinning for months. The story of a fading mind, of a woman who couldn't remember where she put her tea, let alone how to navigate a treacherous attic. Sarah looked at the date again. Last Tuesday, the day Eleanor had claimed she was too dizzy to leave her bed. The data didn't align. The reality was shifting. She turned the first page of the diary. Her own handwriting, the looping, optimistic script of a 12-year-old, greeted her. June 12th. We went to the lake today. The water was blue and cold. Asterisk. But across the words, a violent slash of crimson ink had been drawn. Above her original sentence, a new hand had written in cramped, aggressive letters. "No, we stayed home. You were sick. You imagined the lake." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She flipped the page. July 4th. Dad bought fireworks. We sat on the lawn and watched the sparks. Again, the red ink intervened, thick and wet-looking against the aged paper. Incorrect. There were no fireworks. You cried because of the noise. We sat in the basement in the dark. She turned page after page, her eyes widening behind her glasses. Every memory, every cherished moment of her childhood had been subjected to this forensic slaughter. The red ink wasn't just a correction. It was a denial of her very existence. It was as if a surgeon had gone through her brain and replaced every golden thread with a rusted wire. The humming from downstairs stopped abruptly. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over a page where her mother had crossed out a description of a birthday cake and replaced it with a list of Sarah's behavioral failures. The silence of the house was more aggressive than the humming had been. It was the silence of a hunter holding its breath. Sarah realized then that the dementia wasn't a tragedy. It was a tactical maneuver. Eleanor wasn't losing her mind. She was rebuilding Sarah's. The red ink was a weapon, a tool used to carve away the truth until only Eleanor's version of history remained. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the fresh receipt again. This wasn't old history. The war was still being fought, and the red ink was still wet. The vibration of her phone against the wooden desk startled her. It was a New York area code, her office. She answered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain clinical. "Sarah? It's Jennifer." Her boss's voice was as sharp and cold as a sheet of glass. "I'm looking at an email trail that I find deeply disturbing. Jennifer, I can explain the delay on the Sterling project. This isn't about Sterling, Sarah. I just received a series of attachments from your mother's account. She claims you've been harvesting confidential client files from our secure server to sell to a private estate liquidator. She sent screenshots, Sarah, digital footprints that lead directly to your home IP address." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of the desk, the wood grain biting into her palms. "That's impossible. I haven't even opened my work laptop since I got here. My mother doesn't even know how to use a router. The evidence suggests otherwise," Jennifer snapped. Sarah could almost hear her washing her hands through the phone, the rhythmic scrubbing of a woman cleaning herself of a scandal. "She says you took family heirlooms too, that you're trying to liquidate her estate while she's incapacitated. The board is meeting in an hour. Until this is cleared up, your credentials are suspended. Don't come in on Monday." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the blank screen, the silence of the room now heavy with the scent of lavender and betrayal. Eleanor hadn't just attacked her past. She was systematically dismantling her future. Sarah marched down the stairs, the Bluebird diary clutched in her hand like a shield. She found Eleanor in the kitchen, carefully arranging a set of porcelain teacups. The light from the window caught the silver of her hair, making her look like a saint in a stained glass window. "Mother, we need to talk about the emails you sent to Jennifer Scott," Sarah said, her voice tight. "For the record, I have the receipt for the red pens. I know you've been in the attic. I know you're not sick." Eleanor didn't look up. She continued to place the cups with agonizing slowness. "The light is so aggressive today, isn't it, darling? We should really close the drapes. It makes everything look so exposed." "Stop it. Stop the we and stop the clouds. You contacted my employer. You told them I was a thief." Eleanor finally looked at her. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a sudden, watery sorrow. "Oh, Sarah, you're doing that sharp thing with your voice again. It makes my chest feel so tight, like a bird is trapped inside, beating its wings." She reached for her throat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "The air. It's turning gray, Sarah. Help me. The medicine." Subverted. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Despite everything, the red ink, the lies, the ruined career, the sight of her mother collapsing against the counter sent a primal surge of panic through her. She saw the way Eleanor's face paled, the way her hand trembled as she reached for the drawer where her heart medication was kept. This is it, Sarah thought. her logical mind momentarily silenced by the sheer physicality of the crisis. The stress. I pushed her too hard. The doctors said her heart was a flickering candle. She lunged forward, catching Eleanor before she hit the linoleum. "Mother, stay with me. I'm getting the nitro." Sarah scrambled for the drawer, her fingers fumbling with the plastic cap of the pill bottle. Her mind raced through emergency protocols. Check the pulse, call 911, elevate the feet. She felt a profound wave of guilt. How could she have been so cold? How could she have suspected a dying woman of such complex malice? She was an archivist, but she had failed to see the most basic human truth. Her mother was fragile. "I've got it. I've got it," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She shook a small white pill into her palm and pressed it against Eleanor's lips. "Swallow, please. Just breathe." Eleanor's eyes fluttered. She took the pill, her breathing gradually leveling out. She leaned her head against Sarah's shoulder, her silver hair smelling of expensive shampoo and something metallic. Sarah felt her own shoulders drop. The anger had evaporated, replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion. She held her mother, the woman she had spent her life trying to understand, and felt a moment of genuine, uncomplicated connection. The war was over. She would apologize to Jennifer, figure out the digital footprints later. Right now, she was just a daughter. She reached for the phone on the counter to call the paramedics, just to be safe. Then, she felt it. A small, sharp movement against her side. Eleanor's hand, which had been limp a moment ago, was now moving with startling agility. Sarah looked down. Eleanor wasn't clutching her chest. She was reaching into Sarah's cardigan pocket. With a quick, practiced motion, she withdrew the Bluebird diary. Sarah froze. She looked at her mother's face. The paleness was gone, replaced by a faint, triumphant flush. The watery sorrow in her eyes had vanished, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her lavender cardigan with a brisk, efficient motion. She didn't look like a woman who had just suffered a heart attack. She looked like a woman who had just won a hand of poker. That was quite a performance, wasn't it? Eleanor said, her voice no longer drifting, but sharp and rhythmic. She tucked the diary under her arm. "You always were so easy to distract with a little drama, Sarah. You want objective facts? Here is one. You are in my house, and you are playing by my rules." Sarah stepped back, her knees feeling weak, her breath hitching in her chest. The betrayal was a physical blow, a weight that made it hard to stand. She had been played. The heart attack had been theater, a calculated ruse to regain control of the evidence. "You faked it," Sarah whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast, floral-scented kitchen. "I did what was necessary to protect our history," Eleanor replied, her head tilting in that predatory way. "Now, I think it's time you went to your room. You look tired, darling. You look like you're losing your grip on reality again." Sarah turned and ran for the stairs, the sound of Eleanor's low, rhythmic humming. "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide," trailing after her like a funeral shroud. The next morning, the house felt like a tomb. Sarah reached for her car keys on the nightstand, her fingers grasping at empty air. Her heart skipped a beat. She checked the floor, the bathroom, the pockets of her jeans. Nothing. She crossed the room and gripped the brass handle of her bedroom door. She turned it. It didn't budge. The heavy thud of the bolt meeting the strike plate echoed through the wood. She was locked in. "Mother," she shouted, pounding her fist against the door. "Open this door. This is kidnapping. This is a crime." From the other side of the wood, The only response was the distant, rhythmic thump, 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 thump of heavy boots on the stairs. It wasn't Eleanor. It was a heavier, more deliberate sound. Now, now, Miss Miller. A deep, gravelly voice called out. No need for all that noise. Your mother says you're having a bit of a spell. I'm just here to make sure the house stays secure while you rest. It was James Taylor, the local handyman. Sarah could hear him tapping his boots against the floorboards. 4 quick beats, a pause, then 4 more. The 4 tap. James, she's lying to you, Sarah yelled. She locked me in. Check the door. I did check it, James replied, his voice coming through the wood with a chilling indifference. I'm the one who installed the new deadbolt last night. Your mother's just worried about you wandering off in the state you're in. You just sit tight. I've got work to do in the driveway. Sarah slumped against the door, the cold wood pressing against her forehead. She was trapped in her own childhood bedroom, the very place she had spent years trying to escape. The smell of lavender wax was stronger now, a floral gag that seemed to fill her lungs. She looked out the window. Below, in the driveway, James's truck sat idling, its driver's side door missing, the interior exposed like an open wound. She had to get out. She looked at the window. It was a long drop to the flower beds below. But the old trellis was still there, its wooden slats gray and weathered. She grabbed her bag, shoved her magnifying glass and archival kit inside, and began to climb. The wood groaned under her weight. A splinter bit into her palm, but she ignored the sting. She reached the ground, her boots sinking into the damp mulch. She didn't look back at the house. She ran for the driveway, her eyes fixed on the gate. Leaving so soon? James was standing by the idling truck, his large frame blocking the path. He tapped his boots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and adjusted his cap. Move, James, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I'm going to the police. I don't think so, James said, stepping forward. He reached out, his hand, missing 4 fingers, gripping her upper arm with the strength of a vice. Your mother paid for a full day of security. I'm a man of my word. Sarah twisted, her elbow catching him in the ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening for a split second. She lunged for the gap, but he swung a heavy, calloused hand, catching her across the shoulder and sending her sprawling into the mud. Mark, she screamed, her voice echoing off the white siding of the house. Mark, help! The sound of a second engine roared at the end of the driveway. Mark's old Ford truck swerved around the corner, tires spitting gravel. He didn't wait for the vehicle to stop before he was out of the door. He didn't say a word. He simply lowered his shoulder and drove it into James's chest, the impact sounding like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. The 2 men tumbled into the mud. Sarah scrambled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark was a man of few words, but his movements were precise and violent. He pinned James against the side of the missing door truck, his forearm pressed against the handyman's throat. Go inside, Sarah, Mark grunted, his eyes fixed on James. Get your things. I'll handle this. Sarah didn't go inside. She went to her workspace in the garage, her hands shaking as she pulled the Bluebird diary, which she had managed to snatch back from Eleanor's bedside table during the night, from her bag. She didn't need a heart-shaped key anymore. She needed the truth. She sat at the workbench, the smell of motor oil and wet earth filling her senses. She pulled out her professional magnifying glass, the high-powered lens catching the dim light. She began to scan the red ink redactions, her eyes searching for the data gaps she had spent her career identifying. Under the lens, the red ink revealed its secrets. It wasn't just covering words. It was hiding a pattern. Sarah noticed that the ink was thicker over certain numbers. dates, social security digits, bank routing codes. She pulled a chemical swab from her kit and lightly touched the edge of a redacted sentence. The ink didn't smear like old dye. It stayed tacky, a characteristic of a specific brand of archival-resistant pigment sold only to legal professionals. She focused on a page from 5 years ago. Beneath the aggressive red lines, she could see the ghost of her own signature. But it wasn't a diary entry. It was a scanned copy of a loan application, pasted into the book and then corrected to look like a childhood drawing. Eleanor hadn't just been gaslighting her about the past. She had been using Sarah's identity to build a house of cards. The red ink wasn't just a denial of a lake trip. It was a denial of a $50,000 withdrawal from Sarah's college fund. It was a denial of a forged signature on a second mortgage. Sarah felt a cold, crystalline anger replace her fear. She wasn't just a victim of a cruel mother. She was the lead investigator in a multi-year fraud case. She looked at the signature again. The S in Sarah was slightly too looped, the H too sharp. It was Eleanor's hand, pretending to be Sarah's, then using the red ink to prove that Sarah had never signed anything at all. The storm began as a low, rhythmic growl in the distance, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the garage. By the time Sarah had finished her analysis, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. She walked back into the house, her boots leaving muddy tracks on the lavender-scented floor. Mark was gone, having chased James off the property, but the silence of the house felt even more dangerous. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A sharp, electrical pop sounded from the kitchen, and the house was plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. The power was out. The landline was dead, and when Sarah checked her phone, the signal bars had vanished, replaced by a mocking, "No service." She was alone in the dark with Eleanor. Sarah grabbed a flickering flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed for the basement. If the truth was anywhere, it was in the foundation. The air in the cellar was heavy and thick, smelling of wet iron and copper. The walls seemed to exhale a cold, damp breath against her neck as she moved. She scanned the stone walls, her light dancing over old coal bins and rusted pipes. Near the back, behind a loose stone in the foundation, she saw it, a corner of dark leather. She pulled it out. It was a heavy industrial ledger, its pages thick and yellowed. She opened it, and the data flooded out. It was all there. The embezzled inheritance, the offshore accounts, the systematic draining of the Miller estate. Every cent Sarah's father had left for her had been diverted into Eleanor's lifestyle accounts. "I told you the light was too aggressive today, Sarah." The voice came from the shadows near the stairs. Eleanor was standing there, but the fragile mother was gone. She was holding a heavy brass fireplace poker, the metal gleaming in the flashlight's beam. "Give me the ledger, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice a low, rhythmic hiss. "It's just dead trees. It doesn't mean anything compared to the love I gave you." "You didn't give me love, Mother," Sarah said, her voice steady for the first time. "You gave me a debt I didn't owe." Eleanor lunged. The poker whistled through the air, catching the wooden workbench with a bone-jarring thwack. Sarah dove to the side, her flashlight rolling across the floor, casting long, distorted shadows against the stone walls. The struggle was primal. Eleanor moved with a surprising, desperate strength, her lavender cardigan torn, her silver hair wild. She swung the poker again, and Sarah felt the wind of it pass inches from her temple. Sarah grabbed a heavy box of old files and shoved it toward her mother. Eleanor stumbled, and Sarah lunged, pinning her mother's arms against the workbench. The smell of scorched dust and wet iron was overpowering. "It's over, Mother," Sarah panted, her muscles screaming. "I have the ledger. I have the proof. Eleanor began to laugh. It was a high, thin sound that set Sarah's teeth on edge. She didn't struggle anymore. She simply leaned back and smiled. Do you, darling? Look at the furnace. Sarah turned her head. In the corner of the basement, the old coal furnace was roaring, its iron door slightly ajar. Inside, a thick stack of papers was curling into orange embers. The original bank ledgers, Eleanor whispered. The ones with the real signatures. The ones that prove the money was yours. They're turning to ash, Sarah. Just like your memories. Subverted. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. It doesn't matter, Mother. I have the Bluebird diary. I have the analysis of the red ink. I have the digital trail you left when you emailed my boss. She stepped back, her breath coming in steady, confident cycles. She was the archivist. She was the one who kept the records. She had anticipated this. She had even recorded the last 10 minutes on her phone's voice memo app. The police will be here soon, Sarah said, her voice ringing with the authority of the truth. Mark called them before he left. You can't burn the truth away. Eleanor just watched her, the smile never leaving her face. The police? Oh, Sarah, you really don't understand how this town works, do you? The sound of sirens wailing in the distance grew louder. Sarah felt a wave of relief. She would hand over the diary, show them the ledgers she had found, and this nightmare would be over. She would be vindicated. The basement door burst open. Officer Robert Wilson stepped into the room, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his hand resting on his holster. He looked at the scene. Sarah, covered in mud and sweat, pinning her frail mother against a workbench in a dark, terrifying basement. Officer, thank God, Sarah said, stepping forward. I have evidence of financial fraud and physical assault. My mother. Sarah Miller? Wilson interrupted, his voice ending in that annoying, upward inflection. We received a call from your mother an hour ago. She said you were having a violent episode, that you were trying to force her to sign over her house, that you've been collecting her private papers to blackmail her. Sarah froze. No, that's not. Look at the furnace. She burned the evidence. Wilson looked at the furnace, then at the scorched fireplace poker on the floor. He looked at Eleanor, who had suddenly collapsed into a small, trembling heap. Her voice a fragile whisper. She's been so aggressive, officer. Eleanor sobbed. She's obsessed with these old books. She thinks I'm someone else. She hit me. Wilson looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a weary, practiced skepticism. I've known your mother for 20 years, Sarah. She's a pillar of this community. You're the one who disappeared to the city and only came back when the money ran out. He reached for his handcuffs. Sarah's world tilted. The objective facts were being rewritten in real time. The red ink wasn't just in the diary. It was in the air, in the eyes of the law, in the very fabric of her reality. She looked at the diary in her hand. Without the original ledgers to prove what the red ink was hiding, it just looked like a daughter obsessing over a childhood book. She looked like the crazy one. She had lost. She was trapped in the very narrative she had fought to destroy. The sirens outside were a funeral dirge. And as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, Sarah realized that the truth didn't matter if no one was willing to read it. But Sarah was an archivist, and an archivist always has a backup. Officer Wilson, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, clinical whisper. I know you don't like the color red. I know it makes you uncomfortable. Wilson flinched, his hand twitching. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, Sarah said. She reached into her bag with her free hand and pulled out a small, handheld UV blacklight. You think this red ink is just a mother's corrections. But look at what happens when we change the light. She clicked the button. A pale, violet glow filled the dark basement. She held the light over the Bluebird diary. In the UV light, the fresh red ink didn't just look like ink. It glowed with a violent, neon luminescence, standing out against the dull, flat gray of the older writing. The timeline was suddenly, undeniably visible. The corrections weren't decades old. They were glowing with the heat of a lie told yesterday. "Look at the dates, officer," Sarah said. "The ink is still wet in the fibers. It's a specific archival pigment, the kind used to mark evidence. My mother bought it last week. I have the receipt." Wilson stared at the glowing pages, his face paling. The neon red seemed to vibrate in the darkness, a physical manifestation of the gaslighting. He looked at Eleanor, who was no longer sobbing, but staring at the violet light with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "She's been rewriting my life, officer," Sarah said. "And if you look at the ledger I found behind that stone, the one that hasn't burned yet, you'll see why." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 2 hours later. In the back of the diary, hidden behind the velvet lining that Sarah had sliced open with her archival knife, lay a series of uncashed savings bonds. They were in Sarah's name, totaling nearly $200,000, the last of her father's legacy that Eleanor hadn't been able to forge a signature for yet. Sarah stood in the driveway as the medical transport arrived. The storm had passed, leaving the air smelling of ozone and wet earth. Eleanor was being led to the van, her silver hair matted, her lavender cardigan stained with basement dust. She stopped in front of Sarah. For a moment, the sensory clouds returned. "The garden will be so lonely without us, Sarah," Eleanor whispered. "Don't you think the hydrangeas will miss the color we brought to them?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't log the apology, because there wasn't one. She simply adjusted her glasses and watched as the doors of the van closed, the rhythmic thud hiss sounding like the final chapter of a very long, very dark book. A week later, Sarah sat at her desk in New York. The office was sterile and quiet, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting a clear, blue sky. Jennifer had reinstated her with a formal apology, which Sarah had promptly logged with a high sincerity rating. On the desk before her lay the Bluebird diary. Sarah picked up a gold leaf pen, the tip fine and delicate. She began to work, her movements precise and rhythmic. She didn't erase the red ink. She couldn't, but she could transform it. Across the violent slashes of her mother's lies, Sarah drew delicate, golden vines. She illuminated her original words, the lake, the fireworks, the birthday cake, with shimmering gold leaf, turning the scars of the gaslighting into a testament of survival. The diary was no longer a record of a victim. It was a masterpiece of restoration. Sarah Miller was no longer a subject in someone else's narrative. She was the author of her own history, and for the first time in her life, the record was perfectly, objectively clear.